In a week of uncertainty over foreign policy changes to student loans and the potential of an online NHS, this week's episode of the Roundup by News of the Week will cut through the noise, the worry, and the unknown to explain and analyse British political news in a balanced and accessible way. If you're curious or concerned about the news this week, the Roundup is the place for you. Just a reminder, you can read this episode and check my sources on newsoftheweek.net, where you can access all of News of the Week's other content. Let's have a calm start and talk about the BBC reporting on NHS Online, Labour's answer to NHS waiting lists and speedy access for patients. The aim is for there to be essentially an online hospital available for patients from 2027 through the NHS app. It's likely to be an option for patients to choose how they receive their care, whether they want to go in person or online. Apparently, patients will be able to access assessments, follow-ups and check-ups appointments online, starting with the coverage of 9 conditions like glaucoma, issues with the eye, cataracts, inflammatory bowel disease, iron deficiency anemia, raised PSA levels, menopause, or menstrual problems. Now, I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to comment on why those were chosen, but yeah. The Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, has said that everyone, patients and the NHS staff, will benefit and that it would differ from online treatments currently available since it will be a start-to-finish deal. Obviously, scans and tests will have to be done in person, but this will be done at a local hospital. The struggle for Streeting is that there are barriers to introducing this effectively. These barriers are mostly cost. It's not clear where the money will come from for this. It doesn't look like any new money will be injected, which leaves redistribution of NHS budgets elsewhere or departmental budgets. The second struggle, though, is staffing, and basically, the Health Secretary has said that appointments online will be serviced by staff when they are not working in a physical hospital. The problem with this is that doctors usually use this time for private work, through which they can earn more money. Now, Streeting has said on TV this week that some staff will prefer to work in the NHS, and while that may be the case, it doesn't solve the problem that professionals could earn more money elsewhere. This leaves us with some uncertainty, but it's possible there'll be specific funding in the future as the service expands. For now, though, all it has to do really is work and be well enough and be a good enough option for patients. It doesn't have to be perfect. Switching things up and talking about student loans, Sky News shared that there were reportedly dozens of MPs backing a change to how student loans are paid. Don't be shocked or scared, we can save the stress for the exams because this isn't actually scary and I'll explain why. What we're talking about here is maintenance loans and a group of Labour MPs who are urging the government to make payments monthly to help with the cost of student living. This would mean loans are paid monthly, starting before term starts in September, so we can all budget better, I guess, or that's what the government's hope is. There are reportedly dozens of MPs who support this measure, and it seems to be backed by student unions up and down the country. That doesn't absolve the policy of scrutiny on this show, so we'll talk about it and whether the changes would help and whether we'll see them at all. Firstly, whether they'd help. So I'm a student and I know plenty of other students who don't budget well. My thing is that if people don't budget well currently, they won't be persuaded to budget well with monthly payments. And I can see how it would make budgeting easier. I'm just personally doubtful of whether it will prompt people to budget or not. Some of my friends have made good points about this too, that it could actually make people's situations harder, increasing reliance on their parents, and that seems like a possibility. Secondly, as to whether they'll be implemented, I'd be saying no if I was one of those 8-ball things, because this bill will be brought to Parliament as a 10-minute bill, which is a mechanism of British politics designed to give backbenchers an extra opportunity to affect policy. Basically, it means MPs get 10 minutes to advocate for their policy, at which point it would either be objected to and voted on or pass into the legislative process. Unfortunately for the proposee, bills are often objected to and then they lose a vote. And when they are not, they're not treated as government bills, which means they're up against the timetable which the government sets and they don't have the support of a big majority that the government has. Basically, that means they're unlikely to see the light of day and actually make real change in the country. What it could do is make the issue more prominent, though. Talking about prospective plans are great, but we should probably also talk about plans that are in motion, given the Telegraph noted peers have inflicted a Chagos blow on Starmer. Just quickly, for those who don't remember, the Chagos Islands are right now a British territory off the coast of Mauritius, which are the subject of a deal that would transfer them to Mauritius. This is apparently for compliance with international law and the protection of a military base on one of the islands, although the strength of both these aspects as reasons for the deal have been debated. The military base will cost the UK £30 billion over a 99-year period, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is the crux of the issue today. The legislation is currently in the House of Lords, and an amendment has been tabled which would force the government to go back to the negotiating table and try and get a clause in the deal that would void rent payments in the event the base becomes unusable. In a not so shocking turn of events, a foreign minister, Baroness Chapman, said both the UK and the USA thought that raising this as a possibility would not be helpful. Instead, she pointed to a joint commission being set up for this stuff and to international law, which could provide an out in the event a treaty could no longer be honoured due to the removal or destruction of a vital part of it. But it's legal, so that's probably debatable. All this will likely renew accusations that peers in the Lords are trying to derail the treaty and delay government legislation, especially since there is already a provision over this in international law. So whether this amendment will go through, I think you can be pretty sure it won't, purely because the government has a majority and the Lords can only delay legislation. They can't force the amendments or indeed scrap the policy. So if the government wanted to go through, as I've said many times in this show, they will make it go through. Moving on, though, because there is a lot, perhaps more than ever, to talk about in foreign policy. How do you feel about a post-Brexit transfer of power to the EU? Because that is exactly what the Times have reported on. Basically, the government are preparing a major bill that could see British sovereignty and legal power transferred to the EU over things like food standards and animal welfare in return for an enhanced trading relationship and, in theory, economic growth. It's thought that British businesses are already abiding by most regulations the EU would set, reducing the economic downside in compliance to such a measure. But it isn't clear at the moment just how much this would benefit the UK, and the reason for that is because the plans would come alongside negotiations with the EU to hammer out exactly what would be controlled and what would be set by the EU. This creates uncertainty because negotiating with the EU was famously a struggle the last time the government tried. Now, with that in mind and the ghost of Brexit looming, will this go through? Every party is seemingly going to contest this. The Lib Dems are looking for a vote in Parliament on the customs union, and Reform and the Conservatives will likely look to block what they will see as absolutely a loss of sovereignty. As the government are trying to time this legislation so that it can use the next Parliament and the next King's Speech to limit the scrutiny the Lords can put on it, passage could be made easier. But right now, the government have a majority. They have political capital, some, which they might have less of in the future. So they could force it through. If they wait until a situation where they can put it through the Lords and therefore limit scrutiny there, yes, it will stop delays. But it's not a given that this will actually help the legislative process. So, like anything, and like I've said already, if they want it to happen, it will likely happen. But it's not a given just yet. There's been plenty of times over the last year and a half where changes the government have proposed haven't worked out because of backbench rebellions. What we're kind of looking for is how much Brexit still affects British politics and how much individual politicians will feel quite strongly against this measure. So yeah, it's likely, but it's not a given. Aside from this, there is a pretty big elephant in the room with foreign policy this week, and that's over the UK's involvement with the USA's action. Last week, we talked about Starmer reacting to the USA's intervention in Venezuela. This week, we're talking about the UK's involvement in more of the USA's affairs. Now, tensions seem to have escalated this week, with Russia being drawn into the conversation after the US Coast Guard tracked and seized a ship that it had sanctioned with British help while it was flying a Russian flag. Russia reacted negatively to the seizure, but the truth is the vessel has had 6 names since 2020 and has sailed under 5 countries' flags. The difference here from what we've talked about before is that yes, there is a negative reaction, but there is also some legal justification for this, whereas last week there seemingly wasn't. It seems that when boats are stateless and have been sanctioned, there is some legal framework for this, according to a former NATO official. Indeed, both the British and the US governments have called the vessel stateless, which sort of validates that thinking. The issue is that This raises questions about how far the UK will support the USA. And a good example of the difference here is over Greenland. Haven't seen the US government, from President Trump to his officials, have made claims over the USA needing Greenland or that they take it by any means necessary. Now, Reuters reported that Starmer has told the Danish PM that he stood with Denmark in its defence of Greenland. Given this, and last week's lack of support for the Trump administration's action in Venezuela, it seems there is a line for Starmer. The Greenland issue, you would expect, would cross it, being a likely infringement on NATO and even more of an infringement on international law. And so that probably tells us a lot about the balance. Now, I'm not an expert on international law, and I can't give you a hard and fast rule for what Starmer's reaction to things will be. But you can probably expect the decision for the British government to be made on a balance of strategic interest, i.e., what's better for Britain economically or militarily, and international law, and specifically their interpretation of it. For example, it sounds like the seizing of the vessel was arguably in the bounds of international law, while the action in Venezuela maybe wasn't. That unfortunately means that there isn't a clear-cut metric I can cite. And say next week there was something else, we might be able to say whether it was or wasn't in the international law, and we might be able to then predict the reaction from it. I don't know that, I'm just guessing. But I'll be honest, this was an intense episode, one which was difficult to script and research. So this is the end of this week's episode. I have no general politics or stats and trends for you this week. Now feel free to check my sources in the more detailed text episode, but I hope you have found this useful. If you have, please consider liking and subscribing to News of the Week and let me know what you thought about this episode or the stories within it in the comments down below. The roundup will be back next week in order to help you stay informed. So in the meantime, enjoy your week. Bye.